Today we're talking about the Hyperaccelerated Dragon, which is the move e4, c5, knight to f3, and now instead of playing d6, which is the regular dragon, playing the move g6. Now, before we get into some of the lines with g6, we should ask ourselves, why are we delaying playing the move d6 and instead going for g6? So let's compare what happens when we start with d6 instead of g6. So with d6, they can play d4, we take, they take, now we can play g6, they play knight c3, we develop our bishop, let's say they go f3, which is a common move that you're very often going to see because it does a couple of things. For example, allow white to launch an attack. We continue with knight to f6, developing our pieces, getting ready to castle, and after bishop to e3, let's say we castle, the bishop comes to e2, we play knight to c6, developing our other pieces, they go queen d2, and now we can play the move d5, for example, opening in the center and getting more control in the center, freeing more of our pieces and gaining more space. Now, with the move d5, the thing to notice here is that we've developed these pieces here, and white has developed every piece, and they're ready to castle wherever they want. Now, if we compare this with what happened if we started instead by playing g6 instead of going d6, well then what you'll see is that we'll reach a very similar position. We develop our bishop, let's say they play the move knight to c3, we can play the move knight to c6, and now let's say they play bishop to e3, we play knight to f6, they play bishop to e2, we can castle, they can play the move queen to d2, and now we can play the move d5. And the thing that is different here is that we have the exact same position as black side, but white is down of a tempo. Last time they had this move f3 in, which is a pretty important move because, again, it will help them launch an attack quickly. But instead of f3, they could have, lost a tempo where they went f3 instead of playing queen to d2. So the point is, whatever white decides to do, we're going to be up a tempo because the point is we can play the move d5 in one move instead of going d6 and then d5. And that is one of the main advantages of starting with g6. We haven't committed to going d6, which means that going d5 is a lot more easy because it's not wasting a tempo. So in other words, we're more flexible in the center. If we want, we can play the move d6 at any time and transpose into the normal dragon, but we also have the option to play d5 without losing tempo, and the pawn on d7 can also support sometimes, pushes like e6 and then d5 if need be. And so the point is we're much more flexible in the center, which is definitely the biggest advantage that this has compared to the normal dragon. Aside from that, we have very similar advantages, among all the dragons. For example, this dark square bishop is a very important piece here along this diagonal, especially because white typically castles long. You can develop very naturally and very quickly, castle super quickly, and launching a queenside attack, as you will see later in this video, is typically not an issue. So let's see what happens in some lines. Now, firstly, they don't have to play knight c3. One thing you might be faced with is c4, and this is a little bit different because now the move d5 is much harder to get away with. And so you can continue by developing knight c6, bishop to e3, let's say, to defend the knight, and now let's say you play the move knight f3. They play the move knight to c3, and here, let's say you, there's a couple of options. You could go knight to g4, which is an interesting idea because if queen takes, then you can take here. And in the end, the point is either they have to give away their dark square bishop or your knight ends up in a really powerful position. And this knight here on g4 was much less powerful than this central knight, so this would be a good trade for you. But if you want, you can also simply castle, and eventually, let's say after they play f3, you can make a choice here. You can play the move d6 and transpose into a more normal dragon variation, or here is when that idea of going e6 and then d5 comes into play. And so d6 is possible, and you can, continue, for example, knight h5 and then come knight f4, because again, if they ever take with the bishop, they lose control on this knight. And if they take your knight, by the way, then you can take their bishop with check. So that's the idea. And, this is for the most part a normal position. However, you could also go and play the move e6 here. And now, if your pawn was on d6, you would have wasted tempo, because again, you would move it twice. But in one swoop, you can move your pawn to d5 and actually challenge their pawns. And for example, after takes, knight takes, if they take, you take again, let's say they take, you take, we traded everything off, the end position is really strong for you because your bishop is really powerful in this open board. So like queen d2 to defend the pawn, and then rook to e8. And now your rook gets powerful. Then you can develop your bishop, and, very quickly, pressure will start to build up on your opponent here. So just a really good position for you. And so the point is you have a couple of options if they go for this c4 system, which you're going to see sometimes, because their aim is to control d5. And typically, if you've already played the move d6, then you can't really, or it would be a bit of a waste of time to end up trying to go for d5. But in this system, you haven't played d6, so you could indeed prepare the move d5. But of course, going d6, as I've shown, is also a completely legitimate and fine option. So that is kind of what happens in these c4 lines. But almost always you're going to see knight to c3. This is by far the most common continuation. And here, for the most part, you develop naturally. So knight to c6. If they take your knight, you can take with this pawn here and then open up this bishop. And as you're going to see, this bishop is typically one of the worst pieces you have because it doesn't develop very naturally. So that would be a pretty good outcome for this bishop. If they don't, and they continue by going bishop e3, you develop your knight, they develop their bishop, you can castle. And, if they were to castle, let's say here, well, then you can start with d5. So if they castle kingside as well, instead of going for a more aggressive setup here, you can still go d5, break in the center, and you're not going to get as much from this bishop because their king is not on this side, but they, at the same time, are not going to be able to attack you as well. So overall, this is going to be a more quiet game, where you have still a super solid position because your pieces are just really nice. Your bishop at the right moment can come to f5. Your e-pawn at some point e5 could also be played, and your rooks can simply centralize on the c-file or on the e-file and d-file, and you're just going to find yourself in a pretty solid position. So that's kind of what happens if they castle kingside, but the more fun lines happen if they go to castle queenside. So queen to d2, you can still play d5. Again, a common idea in this hyper-accelerated dragon is to go d5 because your pawn is not on d6. And here, there's a couple of options. If they take your pawn, you take, and then they castle, well, then you can take their bishop here. And in the end, your bishop is very strong. They don't have a dark square bishop to try to trade off for your bishop. Your pieces are also strong, and you have ways, to attack in this position quite nicely with your bishops as well. And so this would definitely not be a bad position. For example, takes, and then bishop to e6, and already this pawn is actually going to become a weakness for white here. You can at some point move your queen and then put your rooks on the d and c file. You're just going to get so much attacking chances here with your bishops, rooks, and queen. So this is what would happen if they allow you to trade off their bishop. But even if they don't, as you will see in later lines, you still have great attacking chances. So if they don't take your pawn, let's say they take your knight instead. Here you can take with the b-pawn. And now it's a little bit different because you're probably not going to put your rooks on the d and c file, but you're going to adapt and instead notice that the b file is open. And that's where you're going to put your rook. And often the b file is even more powerful because your bishop also aims at b2. And so here they take, let's say, you can take with the knight. Let's say they take, you take, and then they castle. Then suddenly rook b8 comes, and you're building up pressure super quickly. Now they can play the move bishop to d4, which is their best shot. Otherwise, you're simply going to crush them along this diagonal and file. So they have to kind of try to take away your bishop here. But then you can simply take and continue attacking. And so if they were to get greedy and take your pawn here, then bishop to e6 comes, and then rook to c8. And I mean, it's very hard for white to survive in a position like this, and you're almost always going to get positions that are super open, especially if there's, you know, a lot of trades, you know, in the center. You're always going to get positions that your rooks, queens, and sometimes one bishop, often also two bishops, just crush the entire open board. And it's, again, super hard to play this accurately as white. So this is, again, one line that could happen if they decide here to take your knight. And then the final option is if they play, for example, f3, solidifying their center. Here you can take with d takes e4, they take, and now you can play the move queen to c7. And the idea is you're lining up your queen on this file, you're getting ready to put your rook on the d file. Queen c7 is a typical idea because it also does not obstruct the ability for these pawns to be pushed forward. So it's a very smooth move that doesn't really harm any of your other ideas. So let's say you continue with bishop to d7, a little bit passive, but the idea you'll see later. Now they could play the move rook f1. They want to attack, they want to crush you, they want to start pushing these pawns forward and line up the rooks on your king side. You continue with a6. Let's say they go for the move h3. Now you can play the move rook to c8. And the idea of moving this bishop out is, well, you don't want to really trade the bishop. That would not end up so well. But you want to make room for the rook to come to c8. And now you're lining up a lot of attacks. So if they play the move g4, suddenly takes, and knight takes on e4 is a beautiful tactical idea, because if they take the knight with their knight, you take the bishop, and if they take with the queen, then there's checkmate on c2. If instead, after knight takes, they take your bishop, well, then you can take their queen, of course. So they have to take the knight back for the most part, or move the queen. But then all of this pressure is going to lead to you winning a lot of material and still have a lot of pressure on the board. And even if you don't find this tactical idea, the beautiful thing about this opening is you don't need to play perfectly. So here, even if you play like b5 and just launch an attack, that's still perfectly fine, because after h4, you play b4, they move, you can take, and after they take, then you win the bishop, because again, they can't take because of the lineup that you've done with the rook and the queen on the c file. And you know, if they take your bishop instead, then you can play the move knight to e3, again, because they cannot take. The queen is pinned to this pawn for the most part. So the rook's attacked, the bishop's attacked, and of course the knight also applies pressure onto c2. So just a really beautiful attack here that you've managed to build. You know, again, you don't need to play perfectly. You can find this, but as long as you play aggressive, in the sense that you launch your pawns at them, you line up your rooks and queens and bishops on the diagonals, good things will happen to you. And so this is kind of going to wrap up the video for today. For the most part, the way it works, if they castle short, you have a very solid and safe game because all your pieces will find good squares. If they castle long, typically one of these files are going to be open, because if they play d4, you take, now the c file is open. If they were to take your knight when you go knight c6, then the b file is open. So you use the file that's open, you put your queen there, your rook's there, and you attack with the help of this bishop. So a super fun opening to play, because you just attack, and typically win. Thank you guys for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this opening guide. Subscribe if you're new around here for more videos like these, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out.